Somnambulism. A fragment. The following fragment will require no other preface or commentary than an extract from the Vienna Gazette of June 14, 1784. At Great Glogo in Silesia, the attention of physicians and of the people has been excited by the case of a young man whose behavior indicates perfect health in all respects, but one. He has a habit of rising in his sleep and performing a great many actions with as much order and exactness as when awake. This habit for a long time showed itself in freaks and achievements merely innocent, or at least only troublesome and inconvenient, till about 6 weeks ago. At that period, a shocking event took place about 3 leagues from the town and in the neighborhood where the youth's family resides. A young lady, traveling with her father by night, was shot dead upon the road by some person unknown. The officers of justice took a good deal of pains to trace the author of the crime, and at length, by carefully comparing circumstances, a suspicion was fixed upon this youth. After an accurate scrutiny by the tribunal of the circle, he has been declared author of the murder. But what renders the case truly extraordinary is that there are good reasons for believing that the deed was perpetrated by the youth while asleep and was entirely unknown to himself. The young woman was the object of his affection, and the journey in which she had engaged had given him the utmost anxiety for her safety. Our guests were preparing to retire for the night when somebody knocked loudly at the gate. The person was immediately admitted and presented a letter to Mr. Davis. This letter was from a friend, in which he informed our guest of certain concerns of great importance, on which the letter writer was extremely anxious to have a personal conference with his friend. But knowing that he intended to set out from 4 days previous to his writing, he was hindered from setting out by the apprehension of missing him upon the way. Meanwhile, he had deemed it best to send a special message to quicken his motions, should he be able to find him. The importance of this interview was such that Mr. Davis declared his intention of setting out immediately. No solicitations could induce him to delay a moment. His daughter, convinced of the urgency of his motives, readily consented to brave the perils and discomforts of a nocturnal journey. This event had not been anticipated by me. The shock that it produced in me was, to my own apprehension, a subject of surprise. I could not help perceiving that it was greater than the occasion would justify. The pleasures of this intercourse were, in a moment, to be ravished from me. I was to part from my new friend, and when we should again meet it was impossible to foresee. It was then that I recollected her expressions, that assured me that her choice was fixed upon another. If I saw her again, it would probably be as a wife. The claims of friendship, as well as those of love, would then be swallowed up by a superior and hateful obligation. But though betrothed, she was not wedded. That was yet to come. But why should it be considered as inevitable? Our dispositions and views must change with circumstances. Who was he that Constantia Davis had chosen? Was he born to outstrip all competitors in ardor and fidelity? We cannot fail of choosing that which appears to us most worthy of choice. He had hitherto been unrivaled, but was not this day destined to introduce to her one, to whose merits every competitor must yield? He that would resign this prize without an arduous struggle would indeed be of all wretches the most pusillanimous and feeble. Why, said I, do I cavil at her present choice? I will maintain that it does honor to her discernment. She would not be that accomplished being which she seems, if she had acted otherwise. It would be sacrilege to question the rectitude of her conduct. The object of her choice was worthy. The engagement of her heart in his favor was unavoidable, because her experience had not hitherto produced one deserving to be placed in competition with him. As soon as his superior is found, his claims will be annihilated. Has not this propitious accident supplied the defects of her former observation? But soft. If she not be to Charles Brockden Brown trothed, if she be, what have I to dread? The engagement is accompanied with certain conditions. Whether they be openly expressed or not, they necessarily limit it. Her vows are binding on condition that the present situation continues, and that another does not arise previously to marriage, by whom claims those of the present lover will be justly superseded. But how shall I contend with this unknown admirer? She is going whither it will not be possible for me to follow her. An interview of a few hours is not sufficient to accomplish the important purpose that I meditate, but even this is now at an end. I shall speedily be forgotten by her. I have done nothing that entitles me to a place in her remembrance. While my rival will be left at liberty to prosecute his suit, I shall be abandoned to solitude, and have no other employment than to ruminate on the bliss that has eluded my grasp. If scope were allowed to my exertions, I might hope that they would ultimately be crowned with success. But as it is, I am manacled and powerless. The good would easily be reached if my hands were at freedom. Now that they are fettered, the attainment is impossible. But is it true that such is my forlorn condition? What is it that irrecoverably binds me to this spot? There are seasons of respite from my present occupations in which I commonly indulge myself in journeys. This lady's habitation is not at an immeasurable distance from mine. It may be easily comprised within the sphere of my excursions. Shall I want a motive or excuse for paying her a visit? Her father has claimed to be better acquainted with my uncle. The lady has intimated that the sight of me at any future period will give her pleasure. This will furnish ample apology for visiting their house. But why should I delay my visit? Why not immediately attend them on their way? If not on their whole journey, at least for a part of it. A journey in darkness is not unaccompanied with peril. Whatever be the caution or knowledge of their guide, they cannot be supposed to surpass mine, who have trodden this part of the way so often that my chamber floor is scarcely more familiar to me. Besides, there is danger, from which, I am persuaded, my attendance would be a sufficient and indispensable safeguard. I am unable to explain why I conceive this journey to be attended with uncommon danger. My mind was, at first, occupied with the remoter consequences of this untimely departure, Somnambulism 3, but my thoughts gradually returned to the contemplation of its immediate effects. There were 20 miles to a ferry, by which the travelers designed to cross the river, and at which they expected to arrive at sunrise the next morning. I have said that the intermediate way was plain and direct. Their guide professed to be thoroughly acquainted with it. From what quarter, then, could danger be expected to arise? It was easy to enumerate and magnify possibilities, that a tree or ridge or stone unobserved might overturn the carriage, that their horse might fail or be urged by some accident to flight were far from being impossible. Still, they were such as justified caution. My vigilance would, at least, contribute to their security. But I could not for a moment divest myself of the belief that my aid was indispensable. As I pondered on this image, my emotions arose to terror. All men are, at times, influenced by inexplicable sentiments. Ideas haunt them in spite of all their efforts to discard them. Prepossessions are entertained, for which their reason is unable to discover any adequate cause. The strength of a belief, when it is destitute of any rational foundation, seems of itself to furnish a new ground for credulity. We first admit a powerful persuasion, and then, from reflecting on the insufficiency of the ground on which it is built, instead of being prompted to dismiss it, we become more forcibly attached to it. I had received little of the education of design. I owed the formation of my character chiefly to accident. I shall not pretend to determine in what degree I was credulous or superstitious. A belief, for which I could not rationally account, I was sufficiently prone to consider as the work of some invisible agent, as an intimation from the great source of existence and knowledge. My imagination was vivid. My passions, when I allowed them sway, were incontrollable. My conduct, as my feelings, was characterized by precipitation and headlong energy. On this occasion I was eloquent in my remonstrances. I could not suppress my opinion that unseen danger lurked in their way. When called upon to state the reasons of my apprehensions, I could only enumerate possibilities of which they were already apprised, but which they regarded in their true light. I, Charles Brockden Brown, made bold inquiries into the importance of the motives that should induce them to expose themselves to the least hazard. They could not urge their horse beyond his real strength. They would be compelled to suspend their journey for some time the next day. A few hours were all that they could hope to save by their utmost expedition. Were a few hours of such infinite moment? In these representations I was sensible that I had overleaped the bounds of rigid decorum. It was not my place to weigh his motives and inducements. My age and situation in this family rendered silence and submission my peculiar province. I had hitherto confined myself within bounds of scrupulous propriety, but now I had suddenly lost sight of all regards but those which related to the safety of the travelers. Mr. Davis regarded my vehemence with suspicion. He eyed me with more attention than I had hitherto received from him. The impression which this unexpected interference made upon him, I was, at the time, too much absorbed in other considerations to notice. It was afterwards plain that he suspected my zeal to originate in a passion for his daughter, which it was by no means proper for him to encourage. If this idea occurred to him, his humanity would not suffer it to generate indignation or resentment in his bosom. On the contrary, he treated my arguments with mildness, and assured me that I had overrated the inconveniences and perils of the journey. Some regard was to be paid to his daughter's ease and health. He did not believe them to be materially endangered. They should make suitable provision of cloaks and caps against the inclemency of the air. Had not the occasion been extremely urgent, and of that urgency he alone could be the proper judge, he should certainly not consent to endure even these trivial inconveniences. "But you seem," continued he, "chiefly anxious for my daughter's sake. There is, without doubt, a large portion of gallantry in your fears. It is natural and venial in a young man to take infinite pains for the service of the ladies. But, my dear, what say you? I will refer this important question to your decision. Shall we go, or wait till the morning?" "Go, by all means," replied she. "I confess the fears that have been expressed appear to be groundless. I am bound to our young friend for the concern he takes in our welfare, but certainly his imagination misleads him. I am not so much a girl as to be scared merely because it is dark." I might have foreseen this decision, but what could I say? My fears and my repugnance were strong as ever. The evil that was menaced was terrible. By remaining where they were till the next day they would escape it. Was no other method sufficient for their preservation? My attendance would effectually obviate the danger. This scheme possessed irresistible attractions. I was thankful to the danger for suggesting it. In the fervor of my conceptions I was willing to run to the world's end to show my devotion to the lady. I could sustain with alacrity the fatigue of many nights of traveling and watchfulness. I should unspeakably prefer them to warmth and ease if I could thereby extort from this lady a single phrase of gratitude or approbation. I proposed to them to bear them company, at least till the morning light. They would not listen to it. Half my purpose was indeed answered by the glistening eyes and affectionate looks of Miss Davis, but the remainder I was pertinaciously bent on likewise accomplishing. If Mr. Davis had not suspected my motives, he would probably have been less indisposed to compliance. As it was, however, his objections were insuperable. They earnestly insisted on my relinquishing my design. My uncle, also, not seeing anything that justified extraordinary precautions, added his injunctions. I was conscious of my inability to show any sufficient grounds for my fears. As long as their representations rung in my ears, I allowed myself to be ashamed of my weakness, and conjured up a temporary persuasion that my attendance was indeed superfluous, and that I should show most wisdom in suffering them to depart alone. But this persuasion was transient. They had no sooner placed themselves in their carriage and exchanged the parting adieus, but my apprehensions returned upon me as forcibly as ever. No doubt part of my despondency flowed from the idea of separation, which, however auspicious it might prove to the lady, portended unspeakable discomforts to me. But this was not all. I was breathless with fear of some unknown and terrible disaster that awaited them. 100 times I resolved to disregard their remonstrances and hover near them till the morning. This might be done without exciting their displeasure. It was easy to keep aloof and be unseen by them. I should doubtless have pursued this method if my fears had assumed any definite and consistent form. If, in reality, I had been able distinctly to tell what it was that I feared. My guardianship would be of no use against the obvious sources of danger in the ruggedness and obscurity of the way. For that end I must have tendered them my services, which I knew would be refused, and if pertinaciously obtruded on them, might justly excite displeasure. I was not insensible, too, of the obedience that was due to my uncle. My absence would be remarked. Some anger and much disquietude would have been the consequences with respect to him. And after all, what was this groundless and ridiculous persuasion that governed me? Had I profited nothing by experience of the effects of similar follies? Was I never to attend to the lessons of sobriety and truth? How ignominious to be thus the slave of a fortuitous and inexplicable impulse, to be the victim of terrors more chimerical than those which haunt the dreams of idiots and children. They can describe clearly and attribute a real existence to the object of their terrors. Not so can I. Influenced by these considerations, I shut the gate at which I had been standing, and turned towards the house. After a few steps I paused, turned, and listened to the distant sounds of the carriage. My courage was again on the point of yielding, and new efforts were requisite before I could resume my first resolutions. I spent a drooping and melancholy evening. My imagination continually hovered over our departed guests. I recalled every circumstance of the road. I reflected by what means they were to pass that bridge, or extricate themselves from this slough. I imagined the possibility of their guides forgetting the position of a certain oak that grew in the road. It was an ancient tree, whose boughs extended on all sides to an extraordinary distance. They seemed disposed by nature in that way, in which they would produce the most ample circumference of shade. I could not recollect any other obstruction from which much was to be feared. This indeed was several miles distant, and its appearance was too remarkable not to have excited attention. The family retired to sleep. My mind had been too powerfully excited to permit me to imitate their example. The incidents of the last 2 days passed over my fancy like a vision. The revolution was almost incredible which my mind had undergone in consequence of these incidents. It was so abrupt and entire that my soul seemed to have passed into a new form. I pondered on every incident till the surrounding scenes disappeared, and I forgot my real situation. I mused upon the image of Miss Davis till my whole soul was dissolved in tenderness, and my eyes overflowed with tears. There insensibly arose a sort of persuasion that destiny had irreversibly decreed that I should never see her more. While engaged in this melancholy occupation, of which I cannot say how long it lasted, sleep overtook me as I sat. Scarcely a minute had elapsed during this period without conceiving the design, more or less strenuously, of sallying forth, with a view to overtake and guard the travelers. But this design was embarrassed with invincible objections and was alternately formed and laid aside. At length, as I have said, I sunk into profound slumber, if that slumber can be termed profound, in which my fancy was incessantly employed in calling up the forms into new combinations which had constituted my waking reveries. The images were fleeting and transient, but the events of the morrow recalled them to my remembrance with sufficient distinctness. The terrors which I had so deeply and unaccountably imbibed could not fail of retaining some portion of their influence, in spite of sleep. In my dreams, the design which I could not bring myself to execute while awake, I embraced without hesitation. I was summoned, methought, to defend this lady from the attacks of an assassin. My ideas were full of confusion and inaccuracy. All that I can recollect is that my efforts had been unsuccessful to avert the stroke of the murderer. This, however, was not accomplished without drawing on his head a bloody retribution. I imagined myself engaged, for a long time, in pursuit of the guilty, and, at last, to have detected him in an artful disguise. I did not employ the usual preliminaries which honor prescribes, but, stimulated by rage, attacked him with a pistol, and terminated his career by a mortal wound. I should not have described these phantoms had there not been a remarkable coincidence between them and the real events of that night. In the morning my uncle, whose custom it was to rise first in the family, found me quietly reposing in the chair in which I had fallen asleep. His summons roused and startled me. This posture was so unusual that I did not readily recover my recollection, and perceive in what circumstances I was placed. I shook off the dreams of the night. Sleep had refreshed and invigorated my frame as well as tranquilized my thoughts. I still mused on yesterday's adventures, but my reveries were more cheerful and benign. My fears and bodements were dispersed with the dark, and I went into the fields not merely to perform the duties of the day, but to ruminate on plans for the future. My golden visions, however, were soon converted into visions of despair. A messenger arrived before noon, entreating my presence, and that of my uncle, at the house of Dr. Inglefield, a gentleman who resided at the distance of 3 miles from our house. The messenger explained the intention of this request. It appeared that the terrors of the preceding evening had some mysterious connection with truth. By some deplorable accident, Miss Davis had been shot on the road and was still lingering in dreadful agonies at the house of this physician.